Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's Pub Theology. Glad to have you joining us. If you're joining us online, I'm glad that you are here with us tonight. And if you're joining us right here in the pub at Copper State in Green Bay, we're really excited that you came and dropped in to hang out with us. As always, if you live in the Green Bay area, you're always welcome to come and be with us in the upstairs of Copper State. We love having you here. Hey, if this is your first time joining us on Pub Theology, a little bit about how this works. We're going to have some great conversation about some theological questions, try to tackle one specific topic tonight. And as we talk, you're welcome, if you are viewing us online here, to drop in your comments, your questions, your thoughts. Give us a like and a share if this is useful to you so that other people as well can participate. And we'll just have a good time. We'll talk for about an hour. And then, of course, as I said, afterwards, if you are in the area and you want to drop by and talk to us in person, we always welcome that. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the resurrection, kind of following our last Pub Theology session. 2 weeks ago, we talked about soteriology. That's that big theology word that means just the study of our salvation, how God achieved it. And this is sort of the next step in a way. I don't know. Is there a word for the study of the resurrection? Like a big theology term for that? Risology? I'm not sure. I guess we'll have to look that one up. But in any case, if you are watching us online and you want to go and search that one up for us and drop it in the comments, we would definitely appreciate that as well. But we are happy to have you with us. And we're also happy to welcome a return guest, Dr. Keith Wessel. He has been with us in the past, and we'll let him introduce himself just briefly in a minute. Before we do that, let's say, what are we drinking tonight? This is the pub, after all. I'm drinking the pilot series here at Copper State. This is the Funsies Hazy IPA. And by the way, if you don't know me, I'm your host, Brandon Steenbach, theology nerd and family minister here at St. Mark Ministries here in Green Bay. Mike.
Thank you for hosting. I appreciate you always doing that.
So, yeah.
I have the bucket list. It is a New England double IPA.
Ooh. What are you drinking, Ashley?
I am drinking the Pancha. It's a passion fruit sour.
Ooh.
It's really good.
Nice.
Yeah. So, when it starts to get warm outside, nothing better than a sour. That's pretty good. Keith, what are you drinking tonight?
I'm drinking nothing right now. So
okay. Looks like you're maybe in your office at the college. I guess they don't.
This is actually my office at home. So.
Oh, it is. All right.
Yeah. He made it sound like he may change his mind. That's what I heard.
Depending on how well this goes, yeah.
Right. That's what I was thinking.
Well, Keith, why don't you give us just a brief introduction to yourself? Some people that are watching may never have heard of you, may have not watched the last session. That was probably about a year ago that we had you on. So, yeah.
Well, I'm willing to bet the vast majority of people have never heard of me, which is just fine. My name's Keith Wessel. I teach at Martin Luther College. I teach mostly with the pre-seminary track, although I also teach in the graduate school. Brandon was Martin Luther College's Master's of Arts in Theological Studies, very first master's thesis. And that I had the privilege of directing last year. I'm also bringing my second one in for a landing tomorrow.
Oh, wonderful.
And that would be Dr. Christy Meyer from WLC.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah. And so that's a sense of accomplishment. We recently traveled to Atlanta. We drove over Easter for the baptism of our second granddaughter, Nora Elizabeth. My son Daniel is vicaring in Sharpsburg, Georgia, south of Atlanta. But we were all there. All five of our kids, Allison and Brian, live in Georgia. They're both in master's programs for various things. And Emily and Micah live up in Wauwatosa, but they were sponsors. And then we brought Joseph and Joanna down. And so all of us were together, and it was really special. But, 4 days of driving and 2.5 of visiting, Yeah.
Makes for a long trip for sure.
Well, listen to audiobooks, and that's good. I'm teaching a new course this year, Brandon. I'm teaching the Gospel of John in Greek.
Oh.
And I gave up philosophy.
You gave up philosophy. I think that's a disappointment because you kind of we were kind of discussing you're kind of that Renaissance man flavor that you just kind of love that philosophy stuff.
Well, I do, no lie, no question about that. But it's in better hands with Luke Thompson.
Ah, Luke. Yeah, I guess he has a degree in that, right? That was his first
He
degree.
does. Yes, he does.
Yeah.
So he's delighted, and Professor John Schmidt retired, and I took over John's gospel, and I'm delighted too.
Yeah. Hey, you might like to know this. This year I've been taking some just basic kind of remedial Greek courses, just getting to know the grammar. But we spent a lot of time in the Book of John because it's the easiest Greek of the New Testament.
Yeah, it is. That's why we kind of start our teaching exegesis with that particular book. So.
But I love how many gems you get to mine out of the word when you start looking at it in that original language. What a neat thing to be able to do that. So, yeah, I really enjoyed having a chance to be a part of that. So, all right. Well, we're going to start our discussion here of the resurrection. We just got past Easter, and Easter is about a whole lot more than, what do we want to say, Easter bunnies and Easter baskets and chocolates. And although sometimes it feels like all it is about is all of those consumables, it's really about the resurrection. It's about a point in history where something incredible happened. So we want to dig into that tonight, and we want to understand why that's such a pivotal event, and maybe a little bit about how do we talk with people about why we can be really confident in what happened 2,000 years ago and change with that. So I'm going to start with this question. Why does it matter whether or not the resurrection really happened? I mean, there are a lot of Christians, a lot of kind of churches today, pastors today that'll say, hey, we believe in Jesus. We call ourselves Christian, but they'll say, but it doesn't really matter if you believe in this resurrection thing. Like, you don't have to believe Jesus really physically rose from the dead to be a believer. I can just believe in Jesus and the love and all the things that he talked about. Why is this important? Why does this historical nature of this event have a bearing on our salvation? I'm going to throw this out to you, Keith, to kind of kick us off on that thought.
Well, the way a common sentiment that you said, we believe in Jesus and the things that he taught. It kind of reminds me of the way Paul describes the last days to the Thessalonians, where he says that they have the form of godliness but deny its power. And for me, the resurrection, is there any greater display of power? So I think that particular aspect of it, finally, ultimately, it comes down to the fact that, is God a liar or not? I mean, if you cut through everything, this is the bottom line. He said he was going to rise from the dead, and if he didn't, he's a liar. And if he's a liar, he's not perfect. If he's not perfect, the dominoes just keep falling.
Yeah. That's I think that's really key, and that was C.S. Lewis's argument, right? Which is just that he didn't leave open the option to just sort of say, well, we'll embrace your teachings and see you as a good person and a good teacher, but this business of you being God and all of that stuff doesn't really have to jive with us, right? Like, that's just not an option if you really take the Gospels seriously. If you look at what Jesus had to say, and if you don't take them seriously, it's kind of like, how can you even actually say you believe in what Jesus taught if you don't take the gospel seriously? Where else are you going to find out what Jesus taught, right?
So in a simple earthly way, that applies to, hey, he's a really nice guy, but he's not dependable. You can be a really nice person, but not be dependable and keep your word. And so what you said, Keith, is, Jesus did some good things, but if God didn't keep his word, that's another story.
Yeah, and then you kind of almost ask the question: is God is he good if he's not dependable, right? Like you said, in an earthly way. I can sometimes think of it like the idea that if I were to tell you how awesome of a guy Mike is, and make up a story about him that's not even true, and say, well, see, that demonstrates how awesome Mike is. Somebody says, well, is that really true? No, it didn't actually happen, but it demonstrates how nice he is. Be like, well, that doesn't actually demonstrate how nice he is because he didn't do it, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it really just amounts to what you said, Keith. Do we take God at His word? So why is it then? I mean, what's driving so many people to have that view? Like you said, Keith, there's people who are this. They have the form of godliness but deny its power. What is behind that? Why do people deny this in the first place?
I think there's a number of reasons. The first one is just simple logic. We just never see people rise from the dead. And it seems, Pastor John Schrader preached on this the other morning for Easter about how death seems so irreversible and the irreversibility of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he talked about, anyways, I'm not going to regurgitate his whole sermon, though. although it would be good for all of us to listen to. He's a tremendous preacher.
Sure.
But it's the logic of it. We live in a very scientific age. Ever since really the time of Newton, when science begins to displace theology as the queen of the studies in the European universities, we've been in the age of science and empirical evidence. And so, where is the evidence for this? And admittedly, it's negative evidence, right? It's not positive evidence, it's negative, in the sense that there is no body.
Yeah.
we can't produce it. And that's kind of, for us, that's the whole point. You can't produce it. But so it's more the, people want the evidence, but our entire hope is based on the absence of the evidence, which for us is the certainty. But that doesn't fly with the modern mind, does it?
Yeah. And I see what you're saying. I want to go down that trail of the evidence in a minute, but I just wanted to. There was a thought that was going through my head here about this. That you said that the way that people kind of think is like, well, we don't see people rise from the dead, therefore it couldn't have happened.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, like, that's exactly the point. We don't see people rise from the dead. So the fact that it happened is what makes this a unique and special experience or special thing. If I was going to tell you about some miraculous thing that I saw walking down the street, and I said, oh my goodness, I looked up in the sky and there was a dragon. It was a flying dragon. It was breathing fire in the clouds, and it was swooping around. And you said, okay, Brandon, but there's no such thing as dragons, so obviously you were wrong. Okay, well, but if my point is that something amazing happened that defies explanation, then just telling me there's got to be an explanation doesn't actually satisfy, because if I believe what I saw with my own two eyes, then I believe it.
Well, the Age of Rationalism began in the 1700s after the Age of Reason. And then that just, in the theological world, this morphs into what we call neo-orthodoxy. And this has been the plague of the modern Christian church for 150 years. But basically, because of the scientific era in which we live, you deny anything that's miraculous. So what happens then is you have to redefine what you mean by resurrection. And this is what people do. They'll say, well, yeah, there's a resurrection, but it's not a physical resurrection. It's, to use the words of the neo-Orthodox, the charismatic event where you encounter the living Christ. And this sparks a crisis of faith. And this is the resurrection that takes place inside of you, But this idea, are you familiar with Albert Schweitzer? You've heard that name?
The name rings a bell.
Okay, a British explorer, but also missionary.
Yes.
Yeah, and especially to Africa. And he had given a lecture on, his tours of Africa and his spreading of the, quote, Christian gospel. But at the banquet after one of his presentations, it was here in America, and he was seated at a table with the editor of Christianity Today. And the editor pressed him a little bit and said, Dr. Schweitzer, do you believe that Jesus physically rose from the dead? And Albert Schweitzer said, what magazine did you say you're from? Christianity Today? Well, that sounds like Christianity yesterday.
Huh.
You know?
Interesting.
Yeah. So people, because it's miraculous, and
Yeah.
the miraculous has no room in our modern scientific age. Although it is interesting to note how the rise right now in our current culture around the world too, but especially in the European cultures, the rise in the occult uh, seems to be on the upswing.
Okay.
And we can deny the science, but there is that spiritual side of us that craves to be satisfied
Mhm.
instead of this sheer scientific determinism, which is quite fatalistic, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah. This is making me think about something though, because if we live in this rationalistic kind of anti-miraculous, anti-spiritualistic culture, or that at least one that says, well, you can't have miraculous things happen, and yet we are willing as a society to accept ideas that defy any scientific explanation. For instance, not to go down a politically charged road, but the whole idea of the transsexual transgender movement is
Yeah.
the idea that something that is completely impossible to measure by science can still be 100% true and real. The
Yeah.
idea that somebody's body can somehow be inhabited by a mind and a spirit and a self that is different than what their body is
Yeah.
entirely anti-rationalistic. And
Mhm.
there's no scientific way to measure it, and that's what they say. There is no scientific way to measure it. It's just who I am. Well,
Yeah, in 100 years, when they have to dig up a cemetery somewhere, there's just no way to objectively tell that this was a transgendered person.
mhm.
It's all you can say. You can say it's male or female,
Right.
and that would be the hard science, the objective science, right?
Right. So in some ways, it's like our society is actually open to the idea of something that is entirely scientifically impossible, but only certain things, but not resurrection. And that,
Well, yeah, you didn't even have to go down the politically charged. You just see the rise in the interest of UFOs.
yeah,
I mean, no, it is something you wonder. You wonder what's going on, and that people are craving some kind of uh, experience like that kind of defies our current science and explanation. But there just seems to be UFO stuff all over the place these days.
yeah. That is an interesting observation too. And once again, I think they're looking for a scientific explanation for it, but there isn't one so far. So instead, they're just looking for whatever they. Yeah. Kind of makes me think of an old video with Carl Sagan where he says something about we'll follow the evidence wherever it may lead, but as one guy kind of commented on that and said, unless it leads to the existence of God, in which case that's where we'll not follow it. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, trying to kind of go back in my own memory to when did I really apprehend the idea that the Bible is teaching me that Jesus really literally rose from the dead. And when I went from kind of that childlike I just believe it because people just tell me, to like sort of this maturing mental state and faith that said, no, wait, this is something that defies explanation, but it's still real. And Mike, Ashley, I guess just to kind of get you guys' voices into this, can you think of a time when you actually kind of grappled with that truth? Do you remember that feeling of going, wait a second, like this is really true?
Yeah, absolutely. I would guess it was about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so I think like you, I always believed that. But when I really thought about it and grasped it, was probably about 10 years ago. I was big into running. I was running, 5Ks, different things, nothing huge. And Easter morning, I remember getting up and I went for a run. And as I was running, the sun came up, and like with the clouds, and the rays were just like beaming into the sky. and I didn't have a panic attack. I had what would be the opposite. I just literally stopped running and just had this huge, deep breath of, this was like John running to the tomb. I just had this. This was like John running to the tomb. And I was like so excited. Like, what would that have been like? And I was just filled with, just the energy of running in the first place, early morning, but just that excitement of, this is, he was running with anticipation, excitement, that surprise, like, is it really true? And I just remember turning around and running back home as fast as I could, and then just like getting everybody up. It's like, let's go to Easter. Let's go to church for Easter.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Mike.
Yeah.
Actually, what can you recall a time when it really struck you?
I think it would have had to been right after my freshman year at MLC. So I was 19, I think, at the time, which I was like going through just questioning everything, because I grew up in the church and hearing all the time that like all this is real, but that was the first time I really remember actually grappling with it and trying to think, like, I've always heard this, but like, do I actually believe it as my own? And so going kind of back and forth between like, this is too miraculous to be true, but then at the same time I'm like, there's no way this is not true. And so just kind of going back and forth, and then eventually coming to that realization that like, yeah, of course this is true. Like, this, there's too much in this world that point, like, yeah, seeing just rays of sun coming through the clouds, like just that in and of itself is kind of like, yeah, this is true. Like, there's no way it's not.
Yeah. So as I said, I was thinking a lot about that, and what really kind of struck me, the memory I went back to was, so before I went into ministry, before I went to school for ministry, I was going to the University of Washington in Seattle, and I just remember going through a lot of classes where it was like, I had a philosophy of religion class that was basically Buddhism, just wrapped in a kind of like a course description that was like survey of all the world religions, but we're going to spend almost the entire semester on Buddhism and why you should learn it. And I had another professor of medieval history who was basically just kind of like, Christianity is the source of most of the problems in the world. And I remember riding home on the bus from campus, because I was still living with my parents, but I was commuting on the bus. And I was just sitting there one time and watching kind of all these other people who were just sort of wrapped up in their own thoughts and reflecting on a lot of the things I was hearing in classes and feeling this sort of weight of almost hopelessness. Like, man, there's just nothing good about life when you're being told that Christianity is the source of all problems, and all you got to do is just look inside yourself and hear all these people who are just going through a meaningless existence. And, if karma is true, we're all just spinning from one life to the next on the wheel of karma. And I was just like, but if the resurrection is true, if Jesus really rose from the dead, that blows all that away. I remember putting on a Christian CD that I had that just had one song that was about the resurrection. And it just sort of cascaded onto me. Like, it, as you said, Ashley, it sort of explains so much if it's true that doesn't make sense about the world if it's not. Like the historicity of who Jesus is and the Christian movement, all of that stuff. And we're going to talk about that in a minute here. None of that fits with the rest of the way the world works unless Jesus really rose from the dead. Mm-hmm. And so it just suddenly, like, the world snapped back into focus for just a moment. And I realized, yeah, I've been sitting here struggling only because I was wrapped up in things that aren't the truth. And now I'm embracing it again.
That's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, that was a cool experience. But so I want to dive then into if we believe that this is a historical event, really happened, it really does matter. And by the way, to tap into just the word itself for a second, Paul says it matters, right? In 1 Corinthians 15, he just says, if this hasn't happened, our faith is useless. We're the how does he say it? We're to be pitied more than all other people. People should just look at us and go, you guys are so backwards. My goodness. But if he really rose from the dead, it changes everything. So then, with that in mind, let's talk about, how do we know? What are some of the proofs we can lean on? Keith, I'm going to throw it back your way. What are some of the things that we could? You talked about the negative evidence, right? We don't have a body, but like, what else can we point to if somebody says, "Hey, I'm really skeptical about this"? What else do we have to arm ourselves with?
That's a tough question, because ultimately it is a matter of faith, isn't it? But we have Jesus' blessing that, Thomas wanted the empirical evidence, and he just would not believe without the scientific proof. Well, Jesus gave him that, but then he said, "Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet have believed." And that's us. That's us. No question about it. But you just look, I mean, if we want to go down, the path of, quasi apologetic, how can you not see the whole concept of rebirth built into the whole world? I mean, every spring, things that look dead come to life. I have a vine out here it's a trumpet vine, and I hack it down and it looks like a dead piece of wood until about mid-June. And it just goes crazy and produces all these beautiful orange flowers. But there's that kind of evidence. But as far as how do you prove this to somebody? I don't have an answer to that. Faith is being sure of what we do not see, right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and at some point, we as Christians have to say, I just believe it. I believe that it really happened.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so, I mean, it wends its way into the creeds that way, right? I believe. We can't prove God created the world. We can't really prove empirically I can't prove that the Holy Spirit came through baptism to my new granddaughter last Saturday during the Easter Vigil. I can't prove that. She screamed a lot. The water was cold. The water was cold. Lesson number 1, Vicar. Daniel baptized his own daughter, but lesson 1, Vicar, make sure that
warm up the water. Yeah.
Yeah. So
That's great.
it's a tough question. And, finally, the proof of faith, we can say this, say that, but, finally, the testament of the hope that's within us is the way we live. And this is something people can see. But as far as the empirical proof, people have always been looking for that, haven't they?
Yeah.
I mean, it starts with Thomas. I just mentioned it does start with Thomas. And what's interesting about the Greek there, we just went through this today in John's Gospel. It uses the strongest future negation. And you'd really translate it this way: unless I do this, there is absolutely no way I am going to believe that.
Right.
I mean, it's what we call strong future negation in Greek.
Yeah.
Keith, that's a really good point, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's one of those things that to live by faith may seem like a crazy thing to some people, but it's a very wonderful thing to live by faith. And I look back to in relation to this your question, Brandon. Look back to the disciples, the number of times that the disciples, after Jesus calms the waves, and they proclaim, "Surely this man is the Son of God." The centurion who then pierces Jesus on the cross, "Surely this man was the Son of God." That proclamation of faith throughout that Jesus ministry, boy, that just can't seem to end right there in his death. And to say, yes, he walked with us, he talked with us, he broke bread with us. This man is the Son of God.
Yeah. I'm gonna play a little. Maybe it's a devil's advocate, or maybe it's even a little bit how I feel, though, which is that. And Keith, not that I disagree with what you're saying, but I also kind of look at this from the standpoint of, God doesn't ask us to put faith blindly. He actually gives us and historical events to lean on, right? He says there's real things that happen. Jesus really died. Jesus really rose.
Mhm.
And then to show that he rose, Jesus didn't say to all his disciples, just believe me, have faith that I will rise. And then they just believed it, but rather he showed himself, right? And even at Thomas, where Thomas said, unless I see this, I'm not going to do it. And then Thomas gets that proof.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that I think about this a lot of times, and this has really helped me, is I like to count the generations of faithful believers from the time of Jesus, those first disciples seeing him face to face, to myself. One believer after another, passing down the message, Jesus really did rise from the dead. And I think, when you actually realize that, if you count a generation as maybe 20 years, and look at 2,000 years ago, we really only have about 100 generations of people. And that's smaller than, the size of crowd that this restaurant we're in is going to serve tonight. And that's fewer people than I drove by on the road just to get here today.
There's a lot of people downstairs. I don't know.
Right, and that's what I mean, is that
Right.
100 people is not that many people, right?
Yeah.
And so if I were to say, all right, you tell me that Jesus couldn't have possibly risen from the dead, but I tell you that there is a chain, a line of 100 people going back to somebody who said, I saw him with my own two eyes and I told someone about it, and down the road until it came to me, and that person said, I believe you. I believe it because somebody else told me, and go on back to the person who said I saw it with my own two eyes, and there's this chain. And so there was something that really happened, right? Those people really saw something, and then they testified to what they really saw. There's a cool video. I'm going to drop it in the link here or in the chat for you. If you're watching this online and you want to check it out, this is a historian who she starts it by saying, well, I'm not really a Christian. I don't really believe this stuff necessarily, or I don't believe Jesus necessarily rose from the dead. But she says, I'm a historian, and the way that historians collect evidence, when you point at the resurrection, she says, what we do know for sure is that they must have seen something, because look at these changed lives. Look at all the people willing to die for this message. Look at the way that people, and I love that she uses the example of James, Jesus' own brother, who thinks this guy is crazy. He can't possibly be the Messiah. We've got to stop him. We've got to stop what he's doing. He's going to get himself into trouble. And after the resurrection of Jesus, he shows up in Jerusalem saying, Jesus is Lord. And the things that he writes, he doesn't even refer to him as his own brother anymore. He refers to him as the Lord Jesus Christ. His entire worldview has changed. And Paul says it's because Jesus sat down with him. They just met together. I've always kind of wondered, why didn't the Holy Spirit give us that meeting? I would have loved to see that, especially as a little brother of an older brother who sometimes people think might be kind of perfect, but I know he's not. Kind of resonate with James.
Yeah, well, I wish I would have heard the Emmaus sermon. That's the one. That's the one. But what we have is sufficient, right? And shoot, I had a thought. You were talking about James's radically changed life. Yeah, and he becomes known as James the Just of Jerusalem, and he had a tremendous amount of respect among the Pharisees for his piety, to such an extent that when some people in their zealousness threw him off the temple wall, a drop of about 180 feet, and killed him in 62 AD, then the Romans invade about 7 years later. A lot of people were of the opinion that it was because of the unjust death of James that God was exacting vengeance upon the city of Jerusalem. Yeah.
Interesting. That's when you say that, do you mean that it was Jewish people
Yes.
who felt that? Okay.
Yes.
Because as Christians, I would say, well, Jesus himself predicted this happening,
Sure.
although that doesn't negate the two as both being the same. That's interesting. I don't know, Mike, Ashley, do you guys have other things that when you've talked with skeptics about this, what is your approach? How do you get to get to the heart of this discussion without getting bogged down in kind of those like nitpicky arguments or bogged down in minutia. What have you done?
I haven't really been able to have conversations like that with someone who's a skeptic. So I really don't know.
Your day is coming.
It's going to happen.
Yeah. So I don't know. Mike, what advice can you give me?
I would recommend that there isn't this need to defend yourself. There isn't this desire to come up with some sort of an explanation, and to share it with a smiling face amid the skeptic and go, "You're skeptical. Tell me more. What do you think about that? Why would you disbelieve that?" Or, asking them questions is honestly the best way to start. But there is no need to just raise your voice and defend yourself, and it's, well, why can't you get it, type of attitude. And it's simply what I believe is amazing, and I really hope that you see and understand that at some point.
Yeah, that's really a valuable thought, Mike, and I appreciate it because, it's very easy to kind of get agitated especially when you feel like the things that you so deeply hold to be true are being challenged right in front of you. It's easy to sort of feel that agitation of like, well, wait a second, I got to tell you why I'm right. But then we're just falling into the trap of kind of a worldliness where we have to be right. And the confidence is no longer in us, right? At that point, it's the confidence is
Another thing, that strikes me is Christians are often accused of having a very negative view of humanity. That, we're sinful and you can't tell us that we're sinful. But, it's actually the resurrection, which really shows the great optimism of Christianity, because it wasn't just the Son of God that came out of the tomb. It was the Son of Man. This is the future of this flesh. Lucretius was a Roman poet who lived about the time of Julius Caesar, and he was a big proponent of Epicureanism, which was a scientific worldview that we are just all made up of atoms, and their whole goal was to take the fear out of death. So, this starts very early, this idea, and how the resurrection just flies in the face of all this, that it's a lot more hopeful than just returning to death and nothingness.
Mm-hmm.
But God has plans for this body. And it's good for us to remind our brothers and sisters in Christ that the whole goal of our faith really isn't just to get our souls into heaven, but to have our body and soul reunited, so that with full capacity, running on 16 cylinders instead of an eighth of one, running on 16 cylinders, we can, if we can do all these things, and I know there's a debate about how much of our brain we actually use, but let's just go with the common company line that we use, 10 to 12% of our brain or whatever.
Yeah.
Can you imagine using 100% of it? This is an incredible thing that God has given us in the human body. It is still the crown of creation. It is his greatest work. And the fact that the Son of God united himself to our humanity gives such high dignity to human nature. And that God would go to such lengths to redeem not just souls, but bodies and souls for a glorious future. This is optimism at its highest. But the human mind is such that if you're given the choice, whether you've been hand created for this noble purpose by the very finger of God, or that you climbed out of the primordial soup as a two-celled organism and turned into a frog and then a fish, they choose the latter. They choose the latter instead of the dignity. And it does a lot for self-esteem.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I always think of too, and Keith, I think you know how much I love just the concept of a narrative that really gives meaning to the world, a story that actually has true meaning. And I think our world is looking for that, right? We live in a world that wants to know that there is something meaningful, and that's why we gravitate towards these grand narratives. Why we watch things. I mean, just the other day, my boys and I bought our tickets for the next Marvel movie. There are how many movies in that, and TV shows, and it's this grand narrative. And why are people so attracted to it? Because the idea that there's a grand narrative that gives structure and meaning to the world that you can hang on to and say there is something that goes from start to finish and makes sense of everything. All the other grand Star Wars universe and Lord of the Rings, for goodness sakes, all these things that people just love. Why do they love them? Because it says there is purpose and meaning. Now, all of those are fiction. But the point is that the resurrection actually says, hey, there is actually a true story, a real set of events that is so unbelievable that a skeptic has to say, I can't even, how could I even believe that? Well, because it's the greatest story ever. But it gives meaning, and it takes birth, growth, death, and it gives it all a reason. And it says there is something beyond all this, and it gives us something to hang on to. So,
Are you sucked in? Are you sucked into Moon Knight too?
You know what? I've only watched one episode. I liked the first episode, but we haven't gotten any farther yet.
Well, I'm just trying to stay in touch with my students. That's all.
Well, that's all. That's all. Yeah.
That's all.
I use that same excuse for when I sit down on my day off and play a video game or something. I'm like, I'm just trying to make sure my boys and I are on the same page. Right. That's all it is.
Right now, you can buy the whole 9-pack Lego Star Wars thing, right?
Yeah, they're pretty excited about that. I'm kind of excited about it too, honestly.
Well, if Disney's going to implode here in their fight with Florida, it's up to us Christians to tell the story that there is a happily ever after.
Yeah, I like that.
That's good.
Or as I put it, we ride off into the eternal sunrise.
Yeah. I like that. Going back to what you were saying about our bodies too, and this is really important. I preached about this on Maundy Thursday at our church because this is the big. I think the big lie about our bodies that has infected the Christian church is the idea that our bodies are sort of inconsequential. They're just vehicles for our souls, and that death is just sort of our souls finally escaped and go be with Jesus. And that our bodies are the mortal part of us, and our souls are the immortal part of us. And that totally ignores the fact that our bodies were made for immortality, and they will be immortal for eternity. That's the whole point. And both body and soul together are immortal when they're in connection with each other.
Right. And of course, this is the heartbeat of Gnosticism, right? That begins to infect the church very, very early, already by the time of St. John. And they had words of scripture to back it up, didn't they? Didn't Jesus himself say the flesh counts for nothing and the spirit counts for everything? And Paul says that too, that the soul is imprisoned in the body. But yet Paul condemns the harsh treatment of the body, which is rooted in this Gnostic thought that the body's no good. I think we forget how radical a message this resurrection was in the early Christian context. I mean, the Athenians listened to Paul up until what point? Up until he mentioned the resurrection. Then they said he was nuts. And part of that is because they had no use for the body. I mean, you're right. The soul was the thing, and this goes back to Plato. I mean, the soul was the thing that mattered, and the body was just a prison of the soul. And this, you can see how it sounds very noble, but all the more important, this Gnosticism infects the church, and it's full bore by the 200s, the 300s. And these errors, and of course, then it slips over into libertinism, and it was already in Corinthians, right? Where it doesn't really matter if I go visit a prostitute because that's just a body thing. I'm just taking care of a body thing, and I can do that without hurting my soul. And Paul says, what kind of thinking is this? Don't you
Yeah.
know that your body's the temple of the Holy Spirit,
Right.
and that it has been redeemed at a price for a very dignified and worthy purpose? But this, yeah, and of course the Greeks and the Romans were reincarnationists too.
Mhm.
That's very clear from their literature. And even something like Virgil's Aeneid, which is the great epic of founding of Rome. They're down there in the underworld, and there's the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, where everybody washes their hard drive and gets ready, gets prepped to go into another body once they get the green light to go back upstairs, and they forget what they were in the past life. But
Hmm.
so this idea of the material body as being something good, and the fact that there is only one body for you and it will be resurrected, and there isn't this endless cycle of reincarnation. These were radical thoughts in the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah.
And it's the preaching of the resurrection that meets with such hostility. And you remember Paul, I'm sorry, I'm just rattling here, but
No, please
remember,
do.
you remember when Paul was arrested in Acts 21, and it was just dumb like a fox. He just throws out this argument bomb, this theological argument bomb, into the middle of the Sanhedrin and says, I'm here because of my hope in the resurrection. Then they all start fighting among themselves. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm also convinced that this is, this is why we have the sacraments. That the connection of the soul and the body, the fact that what happens to the body impacts the soul, is exactly why God gives us uh, these means of grace that communicate to the body. This water that washes over my body has an effect on my soul, because my body is not inconsequential. It's not just a vehicle for my soul. It actually is connected to my soul. Jesus gives us his own body and blood to eat and drink because these things impact our soul. And the body, what happens to the body has an impact on the soul. So I've come to appreciate that idea more and more recently, just thinking about the value of the body.
Pretty hard for Jesus to give us his body if it's not resurrected. Yeah.
That's a good point too. Yeah. Well, so I'm kind of curious to hear, what are, Keith, you mentioned, wanting to have heard the Emmaus sermon. I mentioned wanting to sort of sit in the garden and peek around a bush at Jesus and James talking. What are some other fun facts, weird details, crazy church history? I know, Keith, you know a lot of church history, but just interesting Bible things, passages, moments that surround the resurrection. What are some of those things? And Mike, Ashley, feel free to weigh in on that too. What is something that's your favorite?
I'm going to go with the guards. So if the guards at the sight of the angel rolling the stone fell, we're told in Matthew they fell like dead men. It doesn't say they died. So they fell like dead men. When they woke up, was that just like erased from their mind, or did they go to and say, surely this was the Son of God? He's raised to life. What was the impact and the resurrection for those guards to go back to their families or the rest of their life, for that fact?
Yeah, Mike, in response to that, I'm wondering, have you ever seen that movie called Risen?
No.
Yeah, it just came out a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. It's kind of from the Roman military perspective, as one of the Roman military guys gets put in charge of investigating, and he goes and interviews the guards who are at the tomb. Who does it star? It was kind of, it's kind of mainstream Hollywood, but it's called Risen.
Yeah, I've got it. It's on PureFlix, so I'll drop a link in the chat line for everyone.
Yeah. Was it James Caviezel? Was that the guy who starred in that? Or is it boy, now I'm trying to remember. I remember watching that movie once, and I absolutely loved it.
Joseph Fiennes.
Oh, Joseph Fiennes, that's right. Yeah, no, Joseph Fiennes.
My wife was tuning into this podcast upstairs. she grabbed the movie, and Joseph Fiennes, right?
Yeah, he's a phenomenal actor too. I think, and the fact that he's just done so much in Hollywood, and then he played that role was Really,
Yeah.
really kind of cool.
Right. This is Columbia Pictures, but you know what? It was. We really enjoyed it. I thought it was good. I mean, it's not bloody and gory like The Passion of the Christ.
Right, right.
As I understand it, did I catch that right? That Mel Gibson is now like producing a film about the resurrection.
That I've heard a rumor about this. So he just did a movie recently along with who is that? Mark Wahlberg, Marky Mark, and
The
they did
Father
it's called
Stew.
The Father Stew. Yeah, but there was word that they were planning on collaborating on a series of various faith-based films, and actually they want to start a faith-based film studio. And there's some rumors that Candace Cameron Bure is getting involved in that too. The actress who was in Full House, who's Kirk Cameron's sister. So just some interesting things going on that people are really. Yeah, I love that Risen movie. The thing that I loved the most was there's a moment. Spoiler alert, but it's old enough that if you haven't watched it yet, it's your own fault. But there's a part where that Roman soldier walks in on the disciples meeting with Jesus, and it's like he keeps having these flashbacks of seeing Jesus on the cross and then seeing the dead body, and he has this moment where he walks into the room and Jesus turns and looks right at him. And he has that, like, there's a flashback of him on the cross, and then he's looking at him again. And Jesus just smiles, this really knowing smile, like, hi.
Hi.
And the guy kind of flips out. He just sort of like backs out of the room like, what? This is not possible. And then he looks in again and Jesus is gone and all the disciples are like talking to each other. And he's like, I imagine that or whatever. But it's just, that part just overwhelmed me. I loved that.
You were talking about details that are kind of, that we think about in connection with the resurrection. I think the one that causes me to think and pause and kind of shudder is how Jesus never showed himself to his enemies. After the resurrection, he just never shows himself to his enemies. And we kind of say, well, why not? It's almost like a living judgment, and it just, they had their chance. I mean, what more evidence did they need? And it just kind of causes me to tremble,
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it is a judgment because it connects with what does Jesus say about why he speaks in parables, so that they'll be ever hearing but never believing, their eyes seeing but never understanding, or something like that. And he just is finally saying, you don't get to know this. You rejected every other sign and wonder and evidence and reason you would have had to believe in me. Everything that pointed to who I am. The ultimate evidence isn't yours to have anymore. That's pretty
We
strong.
got to hear from Ashley.
Yeah.
Well, I think just a moment, I think that would have been really cool to experience and I guess more feel is in the room with the disciples when, Jesus died. They're just gathered all together, feel for their life. And then the women coming in and sharing that news that the tomb is empty, just to experience just kind of like the mix of emotions of the fear and wait, what? And because nothing like that has happened before, and then just the excitement that they must have felt then as they sprint off toward the tomb to actually witness it for themselves. Just I think that would just be an interesting moment to especially feel.
Yeah, and I asked my class as we went through John's Gospel, how would you have washed Judas's feet? Iron brush, pull out the steel wool, but he does it so lovingly. And then after the resurrection, what are the first words out of his mouth to this band of trembling men who all ditched him? Peace be with you.
Yeah.
And then he says it again, peace be with you. Or even in the tomb where he tells Mary, go tell my brothers, not go tell the lackeys who ditched me in the garden that I'm risen from the dead. He doesn't say that, but just everything breathes of love, and helping them understand and the gospel. Yeah.
It's just that idea of everything has now changed. What I love is as you read Acts and you see Peter as such a changed man. He's still there, right? The guy who's still got his sort of impetuousness and sometimes blown about by his own emotions or his own pride or whatever is still there, but it's been transformed into a man who said he understands suddenly what it was all about, and how it just encountering the risen Lord changes everything. The whole world is different now. There's a great song by Andrew Peterson. It's on his Resurrection Letters album. And it's titled "I've Seen Too Much," and it's kind of from the perspective of one of the disciples who has seen all of this happen, and he's just saying, there's a line that hits me where he says, and I get so tired of this ridicule, but I cannot deny what I've seen to be true because I've seen too much. And I love that line.
Brandon, you were talking about the witness of 100 generations, right? Earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me think, because, I was involved in the hymnal project, but the oldest hymns in our hymnal are the Easter hymns. The very oldest texts are the Easter hymn texts. In fact, Easter was always it. They didn't really even start celebrating Christmas till around 400 or so, or mid 300s.
Yeah.
But that witness, that voice that has, like singing John of Damascus, "Come ye faithful, raise the strain," this hymn that goes way back to the 500s, 400s, 300s, that testimony down through the ages, the song of the church, that also part of the ongoing witness.
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk just with the last couple of minutes we have. And what I'd like to maybe do is kind of have everybody around the table sort of give just one or two thoughts to this. How this impacts us on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I wake up in the morning. I've got a calendar that's got appointments on it. I got things I got to do. I've got a to-do list. And it's easy to just get bogged down in the day-to-day and get to the end of the day and say, now I just want to sit and do nothing. How do I make sure that I don't lose sight that everything is different because of Easter? What are some practices that can keep?
I think having an understanding, first of all, the fact is I'm going to wake up on those days and I'm going to forget that. And thankfully I'm surrounded by people who will not only remind me and hold me accountable for that, but give me that encouragement that Christ is risen. Shared that with someone today, and then they reminded me as they asked me the question. She said, "How has this week been now that Easter is over for you?" And I said, that's tough because I want to live like every Sunday is Easter, like every day is Easter. And she said, absolutely, you can live every day like it's Easter. So there's going to be people who disagree with me. There's going to be people who doubt what I believe and want to argue with me. But I certainly can wake up and say, today Christ is risen. He's risen indeed. And I will have days where I forget that. And I'm thankful for the people who remind me of it.
Awesome.
That remind me of the work that I did this summer. I was down in Milwaukee working with chaplains in schools, and I had the privilege of going into these summer schools and just kind of being, kind of almost like a spiritual figure or whatever. And every day we would have these call and response type things that we would do with the students. And every day I would ask them, the children, like, who are you? And they would respond with, I'm a child of God, loved and saved by Jesus, called to make God known by being a serving leader everywhere. And just saying that repeatedly every day just constantly keeps that purpose on your mind. And you can't help but think of the resurrection, because that's what gives us a purpose every day. And I know we did that for 4 weeks straight. And looking back at it now, I can definitely tell that it made a difference. It kind of just gives you, I guess, a lighter heart. Helps you from being bogged down by the daily tasks of like, oh, I woke up again. I have to do the 9 to 5 or to cart my kids to all these different events, and then go to bed only to wake up and do that again.
Okay. Nice.
Keith, what have you got?
Well, after Easter in our Greek class, we always start class by saying Christos aneste, and they reply Alethos aneste, which is the Eastern Orthodox greeting, Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Well, today they were a little lackluster in their response. I said, come on now, you got to shout it so they hear it in hell, okay? Because they really don't like this. And it's not cockiness, it's the confidence of faith. And so they really let it rip then. That's lighthearted, but now, on a more serious note, this week in the news, the great soccer star for Manchester United, Ronaldo, shared with the world that he and his wife lost a child in death this week. I have a daughter buried in Caledonia, Wisconsin, who also died. She was between Emily and Daniel.
Okay.
I don't know where Ronaldo is at, and it's not my job to do that. But I do know this: it's something that was a source of sadness, of course, for my wife and me, but not devastation. Not devastation. Amid the tears, we have the sure hope of the resurrection of yes, even that little girl Constance from the Caledonia, Wisconsin cemetery, and I've laid a father to rest too, right? And an uncle that I was very close to. We've all done that. People that we're very close to. And at every funeral, it's like, how do you do it without Jesus? And how do you do it? How do you go through a funeral without the resurrection? Because it's the thing that makes it bearable for the Christian. And so amid the tears, there's still joy, and there's the confidence of faith. I won't forget when Professor Potratz's wife died, Grace, died of cancer at the age of 62. And the song that she chose for her funeral, God's own child, I gladly say it, I am baptized into Christ, and I don't think there was a dry eye in the church, but they were singing loudly. And my father had written his own funeral service, but the very opening hymn was Jesus Priceless Treasure. And the Wessels, which are part of the greater Nolte clan,
I didn't know that.
they raised the roof on that church, St. John's, and just to hear Lutherans belt that out almost defiantly in the face of death, this is what the resurrection does for us.
I love that image, that defiance of death. We defy it.
Satan, I defy thee.
Yeah. What a great sentiment, and what a great anthem and battle hymn for us. The resurrection is.
Keith,
awesome.
Thanks for sharing that loss with us. I'm sorry about that. I appreciate your words and sharing that in this victory.
Absolutely.
It was many years ago, of course, 1995 it was, but every milestone when we have a kid graduate or a kid get married, you kind of think, well, this is where Constance would have fit in.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, for the Christian, it's parenting the easy way. Huh?
Yeah. I didn't have to get them there. God got her there first.
Parenting the easy way.
Yeah. I think of it with this kind of extended hope of long-term friendship and relationship. And I know, Keith, you've already experienced this, and Mike, you're kind of coming up on this as well. That as our kids get older and they start to move away, and this feeling of loss, I'm looking at a son who's just a couple years away from. He wants to go Coast Guard Academy. I've looked at their whole annual program. He gets about 3 weeks off all year. So if he makes it, which I really hope he does, I'm trying to help him get there. But I also know that if he does, it means for 4 years, I'll see my son very little. And after that, I don't have any clue whether or not I'll see him. And where what I cling to when I have nights where I'm laying there thinking about that and just this weight is settling on my heart, I think, but we're going to spend eternity together. I'm going to have forever to walk next to my son and talk to him about what his life was like and how God's grace, showered on him through all those things. But it's kind of struck me even more lately, especially with the business in Ukraine and other things that just, I wonder, are my two young men just a couple of years away from being drafted, and then who knows? And what terrors are they going to have to live through? Will they even live through them? And the resurrection is what gives me the hope that whatever God wills, as much as it hurts to think that there could be a tragedy ahead, the resurrection tells me it's not the end. It won't be the end. It's going to be okay. So every time I feel that burden, I go back to that. We are at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Keith, for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. I know it was kind of last minute I reached out to you, and glad that you were able to.
It was my pleasure. I hope your graduate schools studies are going well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, they are. Now that I am kind of finishing up this process of doing some Greek work, I'm kind of putting to rest another thing. So now I get to really focus on starting to build my thesis, kind of slowly but surely. So, but we have a professor who always says, "How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time." So that's what I'm doing, one bite at a time. It's going well. So thanks again, Ashley and Mike. Thank you to all of you who joined us online. If you do have a chance to, if this was good for you, if this was helpful, if you're watching this live, you're watching it after the fact, whatever, please do share, like, and comment. And please also look for our Pub Theology Facebook group. It's just a chance to catch these sessions and others in the future, and also a place where you can share your thoughts and ideas and just have a little bit of extra insight and be part of the conversation. So once again, thank you for joining us tonight. In 2 weeks, actually, I haven't talked to her about it yet. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. We have a new person on staff at St. Mark as of fairly recently. And I'm hoping that we can have a chance to talk to her about what it was like to make a shift from where she was to where she is now. And kind of just that step of faith to fully embracing living out her faith as a called worker. So I guess once again, she hasn't actually agreed to it yet, so maybe I shouldn't promise anything. But maybe we'll put a little peer pressure on her.
If she says no, we'll just hire another person.
We'll just hire another person. But I'm really hoping she'll say yes. But either way, we're going to talk a little bit about living your faith on a day-to-day basis. What does that look like? How does that work? And hopefully get some good advice. If you would tune in with us next week, or 2 weeks from now, May 5th, I'm glad to see you. In the meantime, God's blessings. Have a great night, everybody.